the 0 Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining us now is Chris Hedges. Chris has been on the program before. He is the author of a number of books, including War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, and his latest book is Our Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. He's been writing about the situation in Ukraine. We've been reading him and would very much have very much been looking forward to speaking with him. So first of all, Chris Hedges, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you.
Secondly, you've written a couple of pieces regarding the situation in Ukraine, and in one of them, Chronicles of a War Foretold, you wrote this sentence: the war state needs enemies to sustain itself. Is that what we're seeing here in your view?
No, that's not what we're watching in the Ukraine. That statement was that sentence was used to explain why NATO expanded beyond the unified borders of Germany, violating the agreement that the German government, the American government, the French government, and the British government had made to then President Gorbachev not to expand NATO. That was understood. I was in Eastern Europe in 1989, covering the revolutions and the breakup of the Soviet Union. It was completely unanimous in the understanding that expanding NATO beyond Germany's borders would be a unnecessary provocation. Remember, NATO was created to protect European countries from a Soviet incursion. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, NATO should have been rendered obsolete. And then there were a series of other violations. President Clinton had promised the Russian government that NATO troops would not be stationed in Europe. Now we have thousands of NATO troops. The Minsk agreement was never implemented. So there were a series of violations, of betrayals that I think stoked the conflict. All that said, to understand is not to condone. What Russia has done is an act of preemptive war. It is a war crime. Under post-Nuremberg laws, it's defined as a criminal war of aggression. So they were baited, but they pulled the trigger, and it is their crime.
And I think this is so important to understand because one of the deficiencies in the debate right now, as I see it, and I think as others, some others do as well, is that there's a kind of polarity at work here, where you either, if you attempt to provide historical context for a war crime, as you've pointed out, which Putin is conducting, or if you try to point out a certain imbalance in the war crimes we protest as a society and the war crimes we tolerate, you're accused somehow of justifying or creating moral context for something immoral. I struggle with this a lot, and I'm wondering where your position is, where you are on this, when people challenge you this way and say, well, to explain, for example, the betrayals that led to Russia's paranoia, how you balance this, or if you just ignore them when people say you're trying to justify something indefensible.
I'm not trying to justify anything. I have written quite clearly that is a crime. It's a war crime. That's the first sentence of my column. So I'm not in any way justifying what Russia has done and is doing in the Ukraine. Quite the contrary, I've condemned it. But the problem is that if you don't understand, I was a foreign correspondent for 20 years. My job was to become linguistically, historically, socially, culturally, religiously literate, so that I could explain in the pages of the New York Times why many people, including our adversaries, thought the way they did. How did they think? And the fact is the world just doesn't bifurcate into good and evil, black and white. I mean, remember that we invaded Iraq, which was also a war crime, a preemptive invasion of a country that did not threaten us and frankly didn't threaten its neighbors, based on fabricated evidence, based on lies. The Russians actually have more justification for their rage at the Western alliance. It doesn't excuse what they've done. But if we don't understand how other cultures view themselves and view us, then we are destined to stumble forward into one debacle after another. I mean, if anybody I spent 7 years in the Middle East, I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. The whole notion that Iraqi Baathists were going to somehow see us as liberators was risible. The idea that democracy would be implanted in Baghdad and extend outwards across the Middle East was ridiculous. The whole Cheney's promise that the oil revenues would pay for reconstruction, this was a non-reality based belief system. So you have to listen. And unfortunately, everyone from Henry Kissinger to George Kennan, they all understood that expanding NATO was a dangerous provocation to Russia. And in fact, in the column, there's two columns. One is Chronicle of a War Foretold, and the other is The Greatest Evil is War. They're both on SheerPost that you can read. But I quote from a released diplomatic cable by WikiLeaks in 2008, which was written from Moscow and addressed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to NATO European Union Cooperative, National Security Council, Russia political collectives, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State. And it was unequivocal that expanding NATO risked an eventual conflict with Russia and the Ukraine. They even talk about the Ukraine. So it was all understood. Well, why did it happen? Well, it happened because the leading arms manufacturers saw $1 billion bonanza by converting the Soviet bloc weaponry that the former communist bloc held to NATO-compatible military equipment, and that's what pushed it. I mean, Poland just spent $6 billion on M1 Abram tanks. A lot of this money, by the way, is loaned to these countries, so it's putting them deeply in debt. And that was kind of the tragedy, because in 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I was there that night, everybody started talking about the peace dividend, that we wouldn't have to expend these massive amounts on the military with the end of the Cold War. Well, it just showed how naive we all were, because the arms industry was not about to see its power or its profits shrink. I mean, I think that the continuation of the wars in the Middle East for 20 years, especially in Afghanistan, was done to enrich the private contractors and the defense industry. And by the way, their stocks have all skyrocketed with the conflict in the Ukraine. Everybody knew, for instance, in Afghanistan, that the conflict was a quagmire. We know that from the Afghan papers that were printed by the Washington Post. It made no sense to continue unless, of course, you were Raytheon or Halliburton or any of these other large contractors for whom this was quite lucrative. I mean, war has always been a business. And then on top of that, in top of all this, we've now seen the European Union allocate hundreds of millions of euros for weapons for the Ukraine. Germany has announced that it will almost triple its defense budget for 2022. Biden has asked Congress for $6.4 billion in funding for the Ukraine, and that's on top of the $650 million in military assistance we give the Ukraine. So by pumping this quantity of weaponry into the Ukraine, we're only sustaining this conflict. There should be a moratorium on weapons and negotiations to get, of course, Russian troops to withdraw. I don't think Russia's demand that Ukraine be a neutral country is unreasonable. especially when you look at Russian history. The Nazis devastated with the invasion of Russia, of the Soviet Union, devastated the country. And a century before, Napoleon did the same thing. My father was a cryptographer at the Tehran Conference. He coded all of Roosevelt's correspondence. And the Tehran Conference was really about allowing Stalin to have a buffer zone in Eastern Europe for this reason. And so, yeah, I mean, the Chronicle, it is, when I write that column, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, of course, it's taken from Gabriel Garcia Marquez's great novel, where everybody knows that there's a death about to happen, that it's completely transparent, but nobody steps in to stop it. And that is, the great tragedy of where we are today.
And I do want to talk a little bit, Chris, about this moment of naive optimism that a number of us had. And I hope you'll continue to speak to me after I tell you what I'm about to tell you. But I was in Eastern Europe myself in 1989 through 1993 as working for the State Department. And that was a moment in history when relatively naive sort of Democratic Party liberal, which is how I characterized myself in those days, thought we were really helping to create a new order that was, these were the days, for example, when Germans, during the process of reunification of East and West Germany, there was a so-called Third Way movement, very different, which you probably recall, very different from the Third Way movement in the United States, something trying to look for a sort of socialist alternative to communism versus capitalism, that kind of thing. So it seemed pregnant with possibility in terms of the naivete. Obviously, my political views have changed a lot since then, but in terms of the naivete many of us felt at the time, is it as just clear cut as we didn't understand how effective the military and national security industries would be in making sure that our social and political militarization continued? Did we just not see that? Is that the force that misdirected us and led us to where we are?
Yeah, we didn't see it. I didn't see it. Most people didn't see it. Because it doesn't make sense to make Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia part of NATO. It doesn't make any sense. It's dangerous, and we're now watching the consequence of that. And there was such uniformity of opinion. In terms of your Third Way, by the way, that was primarily East Germany. I was in Leipzig. Right. That was always really interesting. It was run by, every revolution in Eastern Europe had its own characteristic. Czechoslovakia, which was the most interesting for me, was run by writers and intellectuals and theater directors and journalists, and led by Havel. We used to meet every night in the Magic Lantern Theater. Who knows who ran the revolution in Romania? I never quite figured that one out, although I was there. But yes, the Third Way was was always fascinating to talk to these people in Leipzig, because were very reticent about uniting with the West. They wanted to create some kind of Christian socialism. I mean, they got swept aside with unification, sure, like a tsunami. But yeah, there were those kinds of ideas. And many of the positive aspects of communism, and there were positive aspects, sure, free healthcare, guaranteed wage or income or employment, free education, very good education. We forget that in countries like Czechoslovakia, Charles University, these are really premier educational institutions. All of that got swept aside with the equation of neoliberalism as kind of liberty and freedom, which I think has kind of boomeranged and led to the rise of these right-wing autocrats in Hungary and Poland and everywhere else. Mm-hmm. So yes, you're right. I think those of us on the ground thought the world might become sane, and it didn't.
Right. I think that's exactly right. And one of the things I remember I was actually engaged to a Hungarian woman at the time, so I spent most time there, was the emergence as communism fell, and obviously there were good reasons it fell, and we thought that was a sign of progress forward. But I vividly remember the first time I saw a homeless person on the streets of Budapest, because you didn't, people, that kind of shift, and the fact that Hungarian society, Polish society, I spent a lot of time in Poland and then Czechoslovakia, that there was the principle, for example, of 8-8-8, that you worked 8 hours, you had 8 hours of recreation, 8 hours of sleep. I think many of us watched as that kind of principle was sacrificed in terms of 12-hour work days like those we see here, and no right to know what your shifts are going to be next week so you can arrange childcare or whatever it might be. So by no means was it a crystal clear step forward, and I think we have to be honest with each other as a society here to talk about that. And in terms of the buffer zone, Chris, I also wanted to add that, if the Soviet Union were still around, I don't think we'd be comfortable in this country if Mexico and Canada became Warsaw Pact countries. So isn't this in effect what we're dealing with here? That So
NATO is building a missile base in Poland that's 100 miles from the border with Russia. We almost had a nuclear war over Soviet missiles in Cuba. That's 90 miles from the coast of Florida. I don't think Russia's fear and sense of betrayal, and I don't think any of that is unreasonable. That's the tragedy. Right. That does, again, I'm going to reiterate, not justify the war crime that they have committed and are committing in the Ukraine. But they had far more reason to be concerned than we did in Iraq, where we just fabricated and lied and created weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. So, yes, and this is why it is important to understand how other societies, other cultures, other peoples feel, how they view the world, how they view the United States, because that colors the decisions that they make. Osama bin Laden used to talk about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which I suspect many Americans don't even know what it is. But that was the imperial powers carving up the Middle East for their own benefit. These historical injustices weigh heavy on people. And if you don't understand them, and if you don't understand the weight of those injustices, then you commit acts which we have done, that exacerbate anxieties within these societies.
And you will know, but I think a lot of Americans won't, what the powerful symbolism was to a lot of people when ISIS bulldozed the border fence between Libya and Syria. I'm not sure.
It wasn't Libya. It was between Syria and Iraq.
Because that was, among other things, a repudiation of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. That was,
they were very upfront about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So these are the things I mean, to me, it seems the limits on conversation that we sometimes are expected to adhere to seem to be the moral equivalent of saying, well, we can't talk about the fact that Hitler's rise was partly fueled by the end of World War I and the economic crises that followed. You're not allowed to bring up what happened during the Weimar Republic or inflation. He's just unique. We have this idea of like uniquely evil, and that evil is just manifesting out of thin air. You got what I'm driving at, right?
Yeah, well, that's a cartoon vision of the world. I mean, Richard Evans, in his great biography of Hitler, it's Kershaw's biography of Hitler. Evans did the trilogy on World War II. But Kershaw, which is a very fine biography, argues that if Hitler didn't rise, Hitler would have been created. So it wasn't just the defeat of World War I, but it was the punitive reparations that destroyed Weimar. And then, of course, the 1929 crash. So in 1928, the Nazis were a marginal political force, polling in the single digits. By 1930, they had over a third of the electorate behind them. Why? Well, because the ruling elites decided that they were going to take out massive loans from international banks, and to service those loans, they did very foolish things like cutting off unemployment insurance at a time when I don't know what the exact unemployment figures were, but they were certainly 20, 30%, maybe higher. And that fueled this kind of, fascism. There are reasons behind the rise of these political distortions. There were reasons behind the rise of the political distortion of Donald Trump, who, by the way, may be our next president, given the fact that the Democratic Party is so ineffectual in responding to the very real suffering and concerns of a vast majority of the public, especially the working class. So if you don't understand, the folly that rent apart countries like Germany, or I covered the former Yugoslavia, very similar situation, then you're kind of doomed to repeat it. If everybody becomes Hitler, look, they're already calling Putin Hitler the same way we called Saddam Hussein Hitler. This is just not at all helpful to an understanding of one, how we got here and how we're going to get out of it.
And I'm so glad, actually, that you brought up the idea that if Hitler hadn't existed, someone else would have appeared to take his place. Because I think so much of this misdirection of conversation, Chris Hedges, comes from a sort of great man theory of history and its flip side, evil man theory of history, and they've all been men in this narrative. But the idea, for example, that Obama is a great man, and so therefore we can't discuss drone strikes or whatever. Uniquely great. Putin is, or Saddam, or whomever we're talking about this week, is uniquely evil, as opposed to the idea that historical forces are at work here that might manifest an equally effective salesperson for neoliberalism on the one hand, or a war criminal, as Putin clearly is at this moment in time, as we have been at many moments in time. You get what I'm driving at, right?
Well, Putin is a creation of neoliberalism. Putin is the pet of the Russian oligarchs. And he himself has reportedly amassed staggering sums of money. I've heard figures as high as $100 billion. And the oligarchs man it. There's a kind of quid pro quo. The oligarchs stay out of the politics. That's Putin's demand. And they manage his money, and they can continue to fleece the Russian public. Putin himself is a creation of the economic distortions that took place in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We forget that Yeltsin was essentially a puppet of the West. Of course, the guy was very rarely sober, but when it looked like Yeltsin was going to get shellacked in his re-election campaign in '96, this was under the Clinton administration, they got him a $10 billion IMF loan, of which an estimated $1.5 billion was used to make sure he got reelected. So we talk about, meddling in our elections, and I'm not telling you that the Russians didn't meddle in the elections. I don't think it made any difference, but they probably did. Every country I covered overseas, we meddled in elections. But when we talk about meddling in elections, it's far more egregious in Russia on our part than it is in the United States. And the Russians know this. And so when we look at the preemptive war in Ukraine, the crimes that Putin is committing are no different from the crimes that George W. Bush committed, with, I would say, this difference, and that may change. It may change as I speak. They have yet to attack urban centers the way we did with shock and awe. Now, I suspect that's where Putin's going. But all of the lies, all of the war crimes, all of the violation of international agreements, that was all we all carried out. But of course, we didn't pay a price for it. Nobody imposed sanctions on the United States. Right. And the Russians are acutely aware of that and angry about it, with justification again.
And I note, by the way, that we've celebrated in this country Zelensky is a courageous figure. As far as I can tell, I admire him. But this quote that's been elevated from Zelensky is, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." And I couldn't help but wonder how the American public and media would react if a Palestinian leader said that. So it seems to me there's a high level of hypocrisy, particularly in the kind of liberal exaltation of Ukrainian heroism. And I wrote about that this week. Probably got some of the nastiest and more of the nastiest emails that I've gotten in a very long time for challenging the idea that there's something wrong, not about admiring the courage of the Ukrainian people, but about selectively admiring just the courage of the Ukrainian people and not that of the populations we're tormenting. For example, we're contributing to, largely contributing to, a full-blown humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan right now. So it seems to me the selectivity is a huge problem. But what do you think?
Yeah, it's racism. I mean, so black and brown bodies don't count. So these guys are white. Certainly the people in Yemen are suffering even worse, I would argue, than the people in the Ukraine, which is saying a lot. But we don't care because they're brown. In fact, of course, we're funneling the advanced weapon systems into Saudi Arabia to continue the war. I mean, that's right. Palestine is another example. So, and again, this is largely lost on much of the American public, but it's not lost on the rest of the world because it exposes our hypocrisy. And again, I mean, this is part of my despair at the collapse of foreign reporting, which barely exists anymore. But it's important, especially when you're an imperial power. You must be able to feel the pulse of other countries. Otherwise, you stumble blindly forward, wielding this tremendous military force in ignorance, as we have done in the Middle East. And that, of course, is exceedingly dangerous. All indications are that they are not going to impose a fly zone, but I can tell you that if they do, that Russia's going to see that as a direct act of war.
And, one last dimension of this I wanted to mention before we wind up, Chris, and first, let me just mention this. One of the odd ways that I've seen Democrats polarize this issue in particular is the constant mislabeling of Putin as a leftist of some kind, even a communist. At one point down in Brazil, the Democratic commentator wrote on Twitter that, Putin and the communists are still trying to interfere with our elections. I responded, politely, but said, please don't mislead people into thinking that there's anything communist about Putin and his government and his ideology. And she blocked me, which is typical. But we still see this echo that we're still fighting the communists, which to me seems to have the dual function of creating the same demonization we're used to in the past and tapping into, long-held prejudices, but also stigmatizing the left here at home, which I think has been part of the intelligence reports that have come out and everything else. Are we, in effect, I envision a kind of ideological dragnet taking place. It wants to sweep up not only our military enemies, but dissidents here at home. Do you think there's anything to that?
Yeah, this is the irony, because Putin hates Lenin, hates communism. He's resurrected the Serbian Orthodox. Putin likes the czars. He virtually acts as a czar. He loves big palaces and, the gold rococo and all that kind of stuff. So, but that again is just, reducing the world to easy stereotypes, which really doesn't get us anywhere. He's an autocrat, without question, and a pretty ruthless one. But he's not a communist. He harkens back to the old, imperial structures and the old aristocracy. And the kind of autocratic rule that characterized Russia before the rise of communism. That's where his sympathies lie.
Yeah, and I guess we're running out of time, Chris Hedges, but I had actually hoped to talk to you a little bit about the column you wrote on James Joyce's Ulysses.
Oh, that's another show.
It's going to have to be another show, but I did feel it was almost a foreshadowing in a way.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah, because Joyce hated war, hated nationalism, and there is that subtext throughout Ulysses. And of course, Bloom, Leopold Bloom, who's the main character, is a pacifist, as was Joyce. But yes, it's interesting. He understood the cant of nationalism, and he was appalled by the way writers and artists became cheerleaders for war and slaughter, which he didn't do. Yeah,
exactly. And by the way, I've always felt, I have a Jewish father and Christian mother like Leopold Bloom, and
yeah.
I've always felt there's, you have the stigma of Judaism without the membership. If Judaism comes through the father and not the mother, you're not, traditionally you're not considered Jewish, but you have the stigma. It's kind of crucifixion without resurrection.
Well, yeah. Throughout Ulysses, Bloom, there are very mild slights, and then there's raw anti-Semitism. He's certainly perceived as Jewish. Right. By the wider Irish society, even though, of course, he's Irish, he's not religious, and he famously relishes pork kidneys. Right. Yeah, I mean, Joyce that's another discussion. Joyce is amazing, and Ulysses, which I've read 3 times, is one of the most remarkable works of world literature.
Absolutely. And it is another discussion, but the quote, everybody remembers who's read Ulysses, history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake.
There you go.
Right?
That's it.
So, all right. Well, Chris Hedges, always great to talk to you. And thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.